My guest this week is a family medicine physician and author of 3 books, including human rights violations in medicine. We're going to explore some underlying reasons behind why physicians have the highest rate of suicide among all professions. We'll also look at what you should know and some surprising small things that might prevent another tragic death. She's based in Oregon and recently set up residence in New York City, and one might think dealing with such a painful, solemn subject might make her demeanor a bit sad. But you'd be wrong on that, as she took that first step, courageous step, onto a New York City stage and performed her first stand-up comedy routine in December. All this and more today on Winning Healthcare Food Fights Without the Mess. Welcome to the show, the physician's guardian angel, Dr. Pamela Wible.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Well, let me start by saying I only had an inkling of physician suicides before I heard of you and your mission. And then I started taking a deeper dive into it. And then I found your TED Talk and I went, oh yeah, here we go. I need to listen to this. And then I found your website, idealmedicalcare.org. And one thing that's immediately apparent is this is a deeply personal passion for you. And what I'd like to do is focus on the individuals first, because I know there's a whole backstory behind, medical school and residency, but the physicians, the med students, the nurses, veterinarians too, are taking this ultimate tragic step. So I thought it would be good to explore the reasons and perhaps some misconceptions behind these suicides. You've been there. And I guess the best way of saying it is that you have a firsthand view. You were on the ledge, so to speak. So Pam, your story is important and highly relevant. So maybe a little bit about your own story, and then we can talk about what physicians are going through and nurses and med students and residents. But what's your story?
So both my parents are physicians and I grew up going to work with them as a little kid. So I was very fortunate. I was able to see medicine in its heyday when it was an awesome profession, when patients really respected their physicians. Physicians went 110% for the patients. They did house calls, and it was just like the ideal medical care that all of us would aspire to have today. And, without all the technological advances, of course, but essentially the human relationship was intact and it was a very fulfilling profession. Fast forward, I went into medicine. My parents did warn me not to pursue medicine because I think they had a sense that all this third-party intrusion and complexity was coming, and the beauty of the human relationship was going to dissipate, and it was going to be a tough career and maybe more litigation and, just not as fun. You couldn't bring your daughter to work every day, today, like they could years ago, with all the rules and regulations and all of that. So fast forward, I do everything right, K through 12, college, med school, board certified family doc. I'm finally ready to rock and roll. I start my first job. I'm about, I think 28 at the time. And what I experience is the feeling of being a factory worker on an assembly line. This did not feel at all like what it was in the 1970s, what physicians were years ago. And so I thought, oh, maybe this is just kind of a bad job that I picked. So I tried 6 jobs in 10 years. They were all what I call assembly line medicine, which really sucks for the patient and for the doctor. I think sometimes patients don't really recognize, when they're miserable, so is your doctor. Your doctor's miserable too. And, you can go home and spend the rest of your life with your family, but the doctor is stuck in this miserable situation day in and day out in this terrible job all the time. So that's what actually led to my suicidal thoughts, the dark night of the soul, because if you think about it, I put like all my eggs in one basket. I feel like I was born to be a healer. I did everything right. I made straight A's, I took all the tests, and, in the end, I felt like I was captive in a very dysfunctional system, and that led to my suicidal thinking.
Mm. So that's a good intro as to why physicians are thinking the way they do. And this is not just an American issue. I just read something. It's a global issue.
Yeah.
A third of UK docs report quote unquote burnout, and we'll get to that word, and compassion fatigue. And there's one thing that we should talk about right now, and that's burnout, because that's the wrong word.
It absolutely is the wrong word. I mean, burnout, I think one of the problems we're having in solving this crisis is recognizing the truth of what the crisis is, right? And backtrack a little bit on suicide. We've known that doctors have had a high suicide rate compared to the general population since 1858 in the UK when it was first reported. So we've had, 160 plus years to deal with this. And sadly, my profession has done very little about it. And the reason why we're not getting any traction is because it's been a secret, right? What I actually consider to be the problem is not even suicide, it's the secrecy. Because if we could take it out of secrecy, we actually have the brain power and resourcefulness to solve this, but not when it's a secret. You see what I'm saying?
A little transparency.
Right.
A lot of transparency.
And that's the same thing with burnout. Burnout has been used to sort of cover up more serious mental health issues among doctors. And it's actually an inappropriate term to be used as applied to physicians. And let me explain why. So the history of burnout is it was a word used by end-stage drug addicts in the 1970s, right?
I was in high school from 73 to 77. Yeah, I know.
Right. So like you were a burnout if you were like laying there in an alley with a needle up your arm. You're burning out, right? And so it's a slang term, right, from inner city America. And then what happened is Herbert Freudenberger was a psychologist at the time who was actually volunteering at a free clinic in inner city New York with drug addicted people. And apparently he started using their term and applying it to his feelings in dealing with them, right? Because it's a difficult population to help. You know what I mean? So he started to say, and I don't know that he even originated it. He just popularized it. I think that it, how slang terms become, they end up in the dictionary, right? If they're used enough, right? So I think the staff, social workers and such dealing with end-stage drug addicted folks started applying that term to themselves because they just felt probably complete frustration and compassion fatigue, right, from trying to help these folks, right? And then Herbert Freudenberger wrote a book, about, burnout and perfectionists, burnout and this and burnout and that. And, it started, was on Oprah or whatever, and you end up, the whole population wants to say they're burned out. Bus drivers, housewives,
girlfriends,
care workers, girlfriends, and you have to really think about this. If there's a term that applies to everyone, it probably doesn't apply to anyone. You know what I mean? It's so dilute in its meaning. What is it really, right? And if you think about mental health stigma, which is actually part of the problem that leads to suicide because people feel so much shame enough to keep it a secret, that's part of the reason I think why the word burnout became so popular is it's much easier to say I'm burned out than I'm in a terrible marriage and my husband beats me, or I'm burned out, but my boss is a douche, and whatever else you want to say about your terrible life, and you know what I mean? Right. So I think we've latched onto a term that has very little meaning, even though they've created like all these criteria and measurements and tools and this and that and the other thing. The point is that we're not getting anywhere. I mean, to cut through the chase here, we're not solving the problem by talking about a word that's a misdiagnosis for a whole group of people. I mean, we've been at it for 40 years, talking about physician burnout. It started to be applied to physicians in 1981 in medical literature, and we've made literally zero progress, and we've gone, it's even getting worse, right? Because but meanwhile, to keep this in the medical realm, we've made a lot of progress with so many other things, lung transplants, mapping out the human genome. Think about all the medical progress we've made in the last 40 years in all sorts of other areas of the human body, right?
Right.
but we're like at a standstill with burnout because, quite honestly, it's a misdiagnosis. It's really about end-stage drug addiction. And it doesn't begin to even scratch the surface on what's going on psychologically with physicians in a medical education system in which we've been groomed to accept abuse as normal.
Yeah.
Self-neglect and self-abuse.
Let me ask this, because I have the impression that it's a different thought process going on with physicians versus the rest of the, let's just say, the general public. That it seems to me the general public has sort of this increasing sense of this isn't right. You know, they're kind of going in a slow spiral down. And then they get to that point where they say, okay, I've had enough. Whereas physicians, as I'm reading, and please correct me if I'm wrong, this is a snap decision in a lot of these. Am I right? Or how are they different? Is there a difference?
The difference is that physicians, you're talking about suicide,
Right.
I think right now,
Right.
are highly compartmentalized and trained to keep, the game face on, and smile with a starched white coat. And when you kind of hide all your feelings in basically a training program that has groomed you to live a life of professional distance and dissociation with yourself, to play the role of what's considered a physician, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've accepted your profession's mandate to put patients first 24/7. Your bathing needs, bathroom, the meals, seeing your family, that comes secondary, right? If you want to be a good doctor, you've got to be able to work these 36-hour shifts. And so what happens is that we get acclimated and adjusted to this new world that we're in, which is being a physician all the time, really no personal life. Because let's just face it, if you're on an airplane, even going on a vacation, if somebody calls for medical help, you got to bounce up out of your seat. You know what I mean? You're never
Right.
really, they're not calling for IT help on an airplane. You know what I mean? The computer tech next to you is actually taking a vacation.
Right.
I mean, even when you get to Hawaii, if you're by the pool and a kid's drowning, you're jumping in and doing that too. You're never on vacation.
Right.
You're always at the beck and call.
You're always aware.
Yeah, you're always hyper vigilant to the needs of other people.
Yeah.
And so that takes a terrible toll on you personally. When I heard from a psychiatry intern that she only saw her newborn infant 6 waking hours of her life during the first 6 months of her residency, that is shocking.
Oof.
That is what I would call human rights violations and maternal deprivation that's now going to have psychological impacts on the child's future, lack of attachment to the mother.
Yeah, you mentioned 36-hour shifts, and I was just thinking in terms of sleep medicine, which I was involved with for a little while, sleep sensors, and you go for a certain amount of hours without sleep, and you're technically drunk.
Yeah, it's about I think they say 17 hours. Around 17 hours, you're at 0.05%. At I forget, 24 hours, you're at 0.1. So basically, you're not safe to drive a motor vehicle in the United States. Every country has its own little cutoff. Utah's.
Truckers do. Truckers have a limit.
Yeah, truckers actually, I ended up at what's so funny? I spent about a few months ago, I went and hung out at a truck stop where all the truckers come in to rest on their, I wanted to interview them about their sleep habits, so I was sitting in I don't know, they had a little TV room. I mean, they let me in there and just hang out with truckers, for several hours. And I just asked them hey, how long can you really drive your truck? They're like, oh man, ever since they put these sensors on our truck, they basically, an alarm goes off. It's connected to the engine, right? An alarm will go off at 7.5 hours and you have to stop your truck. It's not an option. You're stopping your truck and you're going to get out.
Wow.
And you're going to check your truck. And you're only going to work a certain number of hours per day. And the beginning of those hours is all about sort of walking around the truck and making sure everything's strapped down properly and checking the wheels. And, they have this whole protocol that they follow. But let me assure you, there's no trucker in the United States that's driving more than 7.5 hours without stopping, or they're getting in huge trouble. because their employer hears that little alarm go off, right? And they get
Yeah.
dinged, right? And
Yeah.
so now in Canada, they don't have that thing attached to they're still using paper logs, like the honor
Hmm.
system, sort of, right? And so it's just really interesting to see that in medicine, you're going to walk in and potentially go to the emergency room and see somebody who's been up 30 hours,
That
you
might
know.
be the first question you ask your doctor. How long? I mean, if I were going to the ER, I'd say, when was the last time you got any rest?
Right. Oh, yeah, because even if they have 12 hours off, they're not necessarily sleeping. They're trying to do their laundry, go to the bathroom, and take care of the other, walk their dog or something.
Yeah,
Like, when are they getting quality sleep?
they don't. I mean, they really don't. I mean,
Because
it's rare.
they're perfectionists, and even when you go home, you're worried, like, wait a minute, did I run the right lab test? What were the results? Let me call and see what happened to this one. Like, you can't let go of these people that you cared for. They're still in
Right.
your mind, circulating around. So even if you were getting into REM sleep, I just don't know the quality of it for
Yeah.
doctors.
On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low, where are we at with public awareness of this problem with physicians? I mean,
1.5, I don't know, very low, pretty low.
why is that?
I think because public safety, people want to feel like there's someone in charge. I don't think people want to live in anarchy, right?
Hmm.
That's unsettling to most people. If you thought the people who were in charge of our health were likely to die by suicide 3 times the rate that you would, choose
Hmm.
suicide, that's unsettling to people.
A little. I
Uh,
might just change into my brown trousers.
right. Yeah, they don't want to think about it. It's too
Wow.
scary to think about. It's too scary to think about the reality of what's happening. So people just run around talking about burnout and wellness. So let's do yoga, have a green drink. In medical, I think, because, by the way, it's still too scary even within medical circles to address the reality of the situation, which is why people are doing all these, let's color in an adult coloring book, and like, they do all these really weird things without specifically saying, wow, I think we have a human rights violation situation happening
And,
here. You know
and
what I mean? It's like
common
handing out
sense.
coloring books at Auschwitz or something. Like, we're not going to get anywhere. You know what I mean? If we don't actually say out loud human rights violations, which is what this is. Um,
I'm 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 laughing at the coloring books at Auschwitz, and the reason I'm laughing is that you had a stand-up routine that you just did, and we're going to get to that. But it's corporate wellness programs. They don't really work. I mean,
yeah, I think you
hello.
probably have some personal experience with that, like,
Yeah. Oh,
corporations work or don't work and the effects on the human psyche.
right. Well, one of the things, and I really want to commend you on this. I just read human rights violations in medicine, and I'm a patient.
Thank you for reading that. It must have been scary, but yeah.
Yeah, I sent you an email about 60 pages in, and it was like, what the, this can't be happening. This just can't be.
Scary but empowering. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as a patient, I got so much out of it because I really do appreciate what's the backstory that you don't see on Chicago Med and ER and Grey's Anatomy, and maybe you see it in the Resident TV show, but there's nothing cultural out there that really shows this. They don't want to, at least as far as I can tell. Maybe I haven't seen The Resident, but
Yeah.
I don't think culturally people really understand what's going on with medicine because TV is
I
presenting.
think there's a timing issue, because if you were to, yes, I might be 20 years ahead in my depth of understanding on a topic that's been shielded in secrecy for a century. But if I were to unleash the full version of what I have in my brain onto even my co-workers, who are physicians or patients, I think I'd give everyone PTSD. You know what I mean? Like, you can't unleash this amount of information on people without having them go into a complete state of hopelessness, right? So I think sometimes what's useful about television is it releases some of this in bits and pieces over years, so that finally, when we do talk about suicide, there's enough of a awareness through some of these watered down TV shows, that are
Yeah.
introducing new concepts at a slow level so that people, can actually take it in versus
Yeah.
being stunned and turn off the TV show, right?
Yeah. It's like getting little drabs of Auschwitz, instead of watching the colorized version of what's
Right.
coming out now. And we need
Yeah.
to keep that. I'm not dwelling on it. I just thought of it that you look at some of those films of it, the real thing, not Schindler's List. That was horrible enough. But the real thing. And now
Mhm.
they're colorizing these things. It's just, ah. And your book, and I encourage people to read this. And the reason is that they will gain a new appreciation of what's going on behind the scenes, what their doctor is going through. And there's an example, and maybe it was you or someone else. Here's an ER physician coming out and telling apologizing that they're 15 minutes late giving someone a pill. And the person, the person there, the family member is angry at the doctor. But what they don't know is that 5 minutes before they're dealing with consoling a parent that just lost a child. I mean,
Right.
that's that compartmentalization of it. Now we're going to get into a little bit of the backstory, but there's a backstory with you writing it, right? I mean, I'd assume that if anyone who sits at a word processor, opens up Word and starts writing, there's a motivation there. And I can tell what the motivation is, but what's the backstory? Did you sit down one day and say, okay, I'm doing this?
Oh, the backstory is after I was suicidal myself and sort of survived by launching my own practice, I started helping other doctors go into independent practice. And 8 years into my clinic, I was found myself sitting at the third funeral, in town within a year and a half for a physician who had died by suicide. And see, at the time when I was suicidal, I thought I was the only suicidal physician that ever walked the planet. I just thought, okay, I've been an odd bird my whole life. I'm kind of fringy. I'm, like, yeah, I'm sensitive. I'm idealistic. Gee, there's probably just something wrong with me. Like I just attributed my suicidal thoughts to my innate sensitivity and all that, right? But come to find out, 8 years later, after three guys in my town, top of their careers, died by suicide, I was sitting
Wow.
there in the second row of his memorial service. I just started thinking, geez, wait a minute now. I mean, this is the third one. Wait a minute. I think this is an occupational hazard. Like what is going on here? It's more than this one man, right? And so I just started counting on my fingers how many doctors I personally knew who had died by suicide or circumstances extremely suspicious for suicide, that were covered up by accidental overdose or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is impossible in physicians, because we know what these drugs can do because we dose them every day. We're not like a toddler crawling in the bathroom with
Right.
playing pills, right? So basically, I counted 10, and I thought, okay, I'm in my early 40s. I know 10 people in my field who have died by suicide, including both men I dated in medical school who died
Mm.
not while dating me, but later married to other women with children, right?
Wow.
And, and when I had that realization, it sort of took over my life. That was October 28th, 2012 at 3 p.m. And pretty much ever since then, this has been on the forefront of my mind. And because I've been so invested in this topic and then writing about it and speaking about it, people just kind of see me as the sort of ground zero, the Smithsonian of doctor suicides. If you have a suicide you've experienced from a physician, call Pamela, send her the picture. My whole house started to look like a shrine to dead doctors. I mean, basically, at this point, I've got close to 1,400 doctor suicides that I've investigated personally myself,
Right.
because, by the way, the police departments and the medical institutions don't research these. I mean, they'll research them enough to say at the police whether it's a homicide or suicide, and then they submit their report and it's over. But when you have 1,400 in one profession, I think it deserves more of an investigation than just, oh, it wasn't a homicide. You know what I mean?
There's a natural desire well, okay, let me just throw this out there. I would assume that there's a natural desire to not for the system, whether it's the police or the coroners or whatever. This is a doctor. We can't we can't say it was a suicide. We just shouldn't do that.
Oh, yeah, there's definitely a tendency to cover these up, which is why I feel like the statistics that we have on, occupational suicides, by profession are warped because, first of all, we're hiding these, and physicians are better at hiding their suicides than probably anyone else. Okay,
Yeah.
and that's just the victim hiding their own suicide, right? They drive off a bridge and then they say it's, an accident or whatever. But also our colleagues, our surviving colleagues, are in a state of denial about just our own mortality, and also they don't want to, look who's filling out your death certificate, your friend who you go to church with in your small town who's also a physician or the medical examiner, right? And so there is sort of this weird psychological pressure going on in the person who's actually going to declare whether it was a suicide or not, for them to say it wasn't, because, let's just face it, your wife or husband might not get an insurance payout. It's the reputation, you go to church with this person, you know what I mean? So now, I mean,
Yeah.
there's feeling of hiding it. Let's hide it, and since we don't have the suicide note, we'll just say it was, and even when they do have the suicide note, they've even said that it was an accident. So interesting.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
so there's a lot of hiding going on, and then it just makes it obviously that much more difficult to solve a problem. Like if we hid Ebola, or if we allowed, this is interesting because of what's going on in the world now with the coronavirus, right? If we
Hmm.
allowed people in Wuhan to just hide their family members at home who had coronavirus and just leave it up to the family to decide, that's not a way to handle a public health crisis. You have to have hazmat suits and people coming in who are like authorities that know how to contain an epidemic, right? But with physician suicide, which has been at crisis levels, I mean, more than 1 million Americans lose their doctors to suicide every year. We're just sort of allowing, well, let's let the family decide how they want to handle this, or let's just do a GoFundMe page. Well, that's kind of a ridiculous way to handle a public health crisis, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And we'll leave it to the family. The grieving family has no extra like energy to do anything. They can hardly get out of bed. You know what
Right.
I mean? So we can't put them at the helm of a public health crisis. So to get back to why I wrote this book, I went into medicine because I'm here to help prevent death and ease suffering. And so when I find that 10 of my colleagues have died by suicide, I guess I just appointed myself uh, to lead an investigation uh, for personal purposes, because I wanted to find out why my friends are dying.
You put on the detective hat. Every doctor I've had a conversation with, part of the reasons they love being a doctor is the problem solving. They love putting on their detective hats and playing medical detective. And in primary care, that's where you have all the variables. And I mean, there are a lot more variables. You're looking at the entire human body plus the environment plus a lot of other things. So it's a great place. If you want to be a medical Sherlock Holmes, boy, primary care is a great place to be.
Oh, I
But
love how you said that. That's absolutely true. People tried to convince me to go into pediatrics and other specialties, because I seem to have a knack for those in my training. And it was like, man, I cannot exclude any organ system, any age, any medical condition. Man, I want to see the whole thing. You know.
yeah, it was Dr. Lou Hoffman who I credit using the Sherlock Holmes analogy there. So I want to credit him for that. He was a White House physician, and after he left the White House, he went on to become what was it, flight surgeon for Air Force One.
Wow.
And I met him at a corporate function, so I have to credit him. That was interesting. He was leaving the next day to go to China to teach the Chinese what they found out about acupuncture. Interesting, yeah. They're not cut and dried, by the book. They definitely think outside the box, and it was really interesting talking to him. But he's the one who came up with the Sherlock Holmes thing. But there's also, and I'll throw this out here, there's a backstory of what's driving this, and you're starting to delve into that. It's the system and the culture, and it starts in med school. So let's focus there a bit. There's a culture problem with the training, and it's been a male-dominated profession for a long, long time. And only in the last, 100 years, maybe 50 years, I don't know, you can correct me, that far more females have joined the profession. Great. But you have this high testosterone factor. And the other thing that my perception of med school being tough was it helps weed out people who are there for the wrong reason. They're there for status or money or some other need instead of serving the patients, which you felt. I mean, that's obvious. So to my mind, that kind of makes sense. But after reading your book, this is gone entirely too far. So over to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, med school and why we are where we're at.
Well, I think in order to understand where we are today, you have to look back, maybe 150 years ago when medical schools were popping up all over the country and anyone could go with just sort of a high school degree and $100. I think that was the entrance, and it was that was what the requirements. And then sometimes people were becoming physicians just by apprenticing with other physicians. And of course, there was like homeopathy and all sorts of other healing arts. And, it wasn't just sort of MDs. So basically what happened that really turned the whole thing around is in 1889 at Johns Hopkins, they started the very first surgical residency, and started a medical school, by the way, that required a college degree and more than just, like you couldn't just be a high school student with a wealthy family at the time with an extra $100, right? So, so the very first surgical residency was started at Johns Hopkins by a man named William Halsted, who was a cocaine addicted surgeon who actually learned how to be a surgeon by watching surgeries in Europe and Germany, because we didn't, if you think way back when, we didn't have any surgical, how do we start a profession when no profession exists? You know what I mean? How does the first surgeon actually become a surgeon if we don't have any training programs for surgeons, right? So if you look back in time, you see this man, William Halsted, who trained in Germany. Apparently, they had a method of training that was pretty darn cutthroat there. And he adapted that method of training for the US and created this program, which would be an 8-year program to become a surgeon after medical school. And it was a pyramidal structure, meaning like there were only a few people that would end up completing, to his satisfaction to get, the certificate, right, to be a surgeon, right? And it was a lot of competition. So people were pitted against each other in a weeding out process where only, a few would survive. And they had to move into the hospitals, pretty much take a vow of celibacy, weren't allowed to get married or any, it was suggested that you not have a personal life at all and you live in the hospital. Okay. Wow. So that's 8 years of, sort of 24/7 availability in the hospital for a group of people, and only a few would survive, kind of like a gladiator fight in a hospital, right?
Yeah.
So that's still impacting us. And the fact that he was on cocaine is very relevant, because I think he felt like people should be able to accomplish as much as he could, right? When you're on cocaine and you're skilled, he does have like native skills that are incredible, this man, William Halsted, right? So I'm not dissing him. He was really good at what he did. He wasn't not necessarily a good teacher. He was really good at performing surgery and research. Not a great teacher, and he was on cocaine, right? So basically he, I think, had a really, he was very finicky too, by the way. He would order his shirts, just as an example of his personality. He would order his shirts from like Europe, and he couldn't find anyone in Baltimore that would iron them properly. So he'd ship them back to Europe to get them cleaned and ironed properly. I mean, like this is the guy that started medical, a perfectionist who couldn't tolerate any mistakes, was at the helm of creating medical education, right?
Oh, Lord.
So that's why we still have this feeling like you've got a big brother, William Halsted, over your shoulder, wanting you to work 36 hours and shut up and not see your kids and be dedicated. And people have the long-term mental health impacts that are now passed on generation to generation from physicians as a result of this man.
Yeah.
Who was great at surgery, and thank him for the surgical advances, including rubber gloves, right?
Right.
We have to thank him for many different things.
They're
However, he had a terrible effect on physician mental health, which is we're still reeling from the results of his methods.
And
right?
medicine,
Were, by the way, adopted to all their residency programs. So all of their
uh,
residency programs were modeled after the surgical residency program.
medicine has changed so much just in the last 20 years since when we had genome was announced in July 26, 2000. So that's when you, as a physician, you knew, okay, this is a big deal, because at some point it's going to come down to primary care. In other words, you're going to be looking at a genome in primary care. They're about $250 now, depending on where you go, to have one mapped. That's clearly in your realm as a primary care doctor. And that's just one thing. There's got microbiome, there's all sorts of tests, and there's so many more variables just in the last 20 years. But medicine has changed just in 20, but the last 50 years, it's been phenomenal. I'll throw this out here. We have residency, med school, and then residency. And so the culture differences between med school and residency, is it about the same? I mean, it's the same kind of stuff they get in med school they get in residency, or is it because
It's similar, though. I have to say there are many, many progressive med schools now, and you could potentially create a very nurturing environment for your medical students. But what really freaks out some of these progressive deans at medical schools is that as soon as they graduate, you're throwing them into the lion's den, back into the gladiator pit. You know what I mean? So
uh,
it's much more difficult to control what goes on at residency because of these insane shit, 28+ hour shifts that are still legal for physicians to work. So even though you can create, such a sweet, medical school experience if you wanted to, and I'm not saying all medical schools do that, but it is possible.
mhm.
If residency is really can be life threatening for some people and can create mental health impacts that if they don't kill you during residency, you may have lifelong insomnia, constipation that you didn't once have, IBS, like all sorts of conditions, hypervigilance, poor sleep, all sorts of things, mental health conditions that will follow you the rest of your life. Which is why, again, I have trouble with the term burnout, because it's like these people have been groomed in a system that has given them mental health conditions that they're still carrying from their training,
Yeah.
and they're not able to defend themselves or get treatment.
When I think of this training regime in terms of the can't cut it type culture, and I'm recalling BUDS training for Navy SEALs, basic underwater demolition school. I mean, that's a military culture, and weeding out those who can't cut it, that was a big deal. And if you can handle BUDS, you can better handle combat. I mean, there's a whole reason why they do what they do, but there's something else a lot of people don't know. It also promotes, fosters, and instills a team culture, and they weed out the Rambo types. They want to get rid of those guys, contrary to what people might think. In medical school and then in residency, I get the impression that it's not a team culture, even though I think medicine is more team focused now. You have care teams because you just can't handle everything by yourself. I mean, this is my impression. So please tell me, take it from there. Tell me if I'm on the right track or.
Oh, you're totally on the right track. I've compared military to medicine quite often. I don't know if you've seen that blog that I wrote in 2016, which was a letter that I published from a medical student. She told me she was in the Army Reserve. Okay. She said she was less stressed in Afghanistan under
Ah,
active
yeah.
sniper fire than medical school.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
And so, I had to call her and unpack that, because it's like, well, that's a pretty dramatic statement there. But what it came down to is she knew on the battlefield that her comrades had her back. If she was blown to smithereens with a landmine, she knew they would pick up her body pieces and bring her back to the United States, and she would have an honored funeral, and her parents would get the little Purple Heart. Whatever they do, there would be a process for honoring her life, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, what's absolutely so stressful and completely shatters the feeling of safety within people training in medicine is the fact that your colleagues don't have your back. This is a gladiator competition, and it's like survival of the fittest, and the survival might be one person, right? So you can't depend on your comrades. See, in military, you know who the enemy is and you know who's on your team.
Right.
In medicine, you don't know who's really on your team. I mean, I guess the enemy is the disease and inside the patient. However, because of the culture that's been set up around medical education, no matter how much you use the term, these lip service terms, teamwork, team huddle, let's do a huddle in the morning, all these cutesy little things, when you have 8 years of knowing that the person next to you would take your spot in a minute if you got leukemia and knock you out. You know what I mean? That's not teamwork.
Right.
So, or if you died by suicide, if nobody would come to your funeral and everyone would just show up the next day and say, I guess he was weak.
Yeah.
That doesn't lead to teamwork.
And it doesn't even begin to solve the problem, prevent the problem.
Right.
So switching gears just a little bit, you mentioned you grew up in medicine. Your father was a pathologist working in a morgue.
Right.
And so for a very young age, here's what, you're 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You went into the morgue, and did you ever pull a toe tag and expect a reaction?
Well, I mean, I saw blood coming down off that little chute, during, I wasn't tall enough to look over and see the autopsy happening, but I saw the body parts. I saw the blood. I was there for the visceral experience of this is death and isn't this interesting? And it didn't scare me because my dad loved his job. That was the beautiful thing about it. My dad had such a passion for pathology, and he's so OCD. I just followed him around and I was mesmerized by all the cool things he was doing.
Did he ever pull any pranks on you? Or was that just you? He wouldn't have done that. Was he just,
I don't think he did pranks. That's not his style, but he definitely sort of had me there in a way. He also, by the way, worked at a methadone clinic and at the city jail before breathalyzers. They had live doctors, sniffing drunk drivers for alcohol.
He didn't bring you there though.
Oh, I was there. I was at all those places. I went to work with him everywhere. I literally, including he was on call for the Philadelphia Fire Department. So we would go out in the middle of the night to huge apartment fires, consider, who would take their kid to a 9/11 experience? You know what I mean? 9/1. It's just, I felt like I was seeing things that most parents or most people would try to shield themselves their entire life from even reading a book about stuff like this. But I was right there smelling the smoke. Seeing the body parts, seeing the blood, my dad had a whole jar, a huge glass jar full of foreign bodies he found inside of people. And Philadelphia was the #1 homicide city in the country at that time. And it was filled with bullets and IUDs and all these fake testicles. He let me stick my hands in there and feel things and bring out bullets, I'm touching bullets that killed people. You know what I mean? As a child.
I'll tell you something. I'm comparing, and I thought I had an interesting young adult. My dad used to teach creative problem solving, and one of his clients was the National Foundation of Funeral Service. I got to know funeral directors, and they're very solemn. You go to a funeral home, they're very solemn people, and they're very reserved and kindly. But boy, you go to a convention of funeral directors in Vegas, and oh my God, everything cuts loose. And thank God they're in Vegas, because what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But they said something very interesting to me, and it's a life lesson that I share. And they said, one of the things that we see as funeral directors in our homes, you see the families come in, you see friends come in, and they stand over the coffin and they say, why didn't I tell you I love you more? Why didn't I tell you you were a great friend? Why didn't I tell you you were this to me? And they would stand there and see this and say, why don't people do that? They should. It's something that the regret that they have, and they don't need, they should just say it. Just say it. Mm-hmm. Don't wait, because there's going to come a day when you're not going to be able to do it. Yeah. So you've got people calling you on the phone and they're saying, I'm at the edge of my rope or whatever. they're really in a bad place. So common sense to me says that you yourself have got to take time for self renewal. And then not long ago in New York City, you got up and did a stand-up comedy routine, death row stand-up comedy routine. God bless you for that. I love it when people do that because that's not easy. That's a very tough thing to do. As any comedian who, has been around a while, not that I am, but the ones that I've seen interviewed. So what motivated you to step on that stage?
This is what motivated me. First of all, I'm one of these odd birds that I've never had stage fright. Like, I love being on stage. So there's no fear. I don't have fear. I really don't. But what happened, so I do a lot of keynote speaking around the country and speak at, medical school commencements and such. And what started happening, really what thrust me onto that stage for doing stand-up comedy, is that I started noticing in the last few keynotes I did that people were like rolling around laughing, and I was getting standing ovations when I'm talking about suicide. And I couldn't figure out, like, believe me, never. I mean, I can understand getting a standing ovation if you're giving a speech on Martin Luther King's birthday or doing something where people are like, yes, like this is, or a birthday party, something. But a suicide speech, never in my life did I ever think that you could get a standing ovation talking about suicide, right? And then so that started happening, back, maybe 5 years ago. And I've never had a standing ovation on any other topic, only suicide, right? And I talk about some fun topics too, right? So, but then when people started laughing through my talks, then I'm like, what the hell? This is just nuts. Like, okay. So basically, because people were, so I record all my talks. And I was analyzing, because I'm trying to figure out, obviously, how to be better, how to, there's so much material I want to get out without scaring people. If there's a way that I'm saying something that's more effective,
Right.
I want to take note of it. So in listening to my talk that I gave at the psychiatric convention, where it was like a 5-day event, and I was, the people wrote me afterwards thanking me. They're like, I was there all 5 days. You were the only one that got a standing ovation. Your talk was great. Like, I'm getting all this fan mail. I'm listening to the thing. And I realized that, like, people are laughing sometimes 3 times per minute when I'm talking, right?
Mm.
And so I just Googled, how many laughs per minute do you need to be a stand-up comedian? Because I felt like I was already being one, and I didn't understand what I was doing, because the laughter was taking me by surprise. And it was sort of, the laughter was an inconvenience, because I couldn't go to my next slide because I had to wait for them to stop
The
laughing.
rhythm. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know they were going to laugh. You know what I mean? So the thing is that I wanted to have more control over the audience, to try to figure out why they're laughing, so that I could utilize my material better to help people learn, I guess you could say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I just realized that you needed 4 to 6 laughs per minute to be a professional stand-up comedian. I was like, oh my God, I'm 1 laugh per minute short. I might as well just try to see how to do stand-up comedy, so I could utilize that as a technique when I'm speaking about mental health, right?
So that's one of the things you do to sort of release and kind of throw off the suppressive influence that people have who are dealing with things. The people calling you, writing you, and saying, "Hey, I'm really in a bad place," and that puts you in a position where you need time to get away from that, and it's tough to do, but it's a lesson learned. And I'm wondering, because your mom was a psychiatrist, and so you also grew up with those deep insights into mental health, and I suppose it's fair to say you were cosmically predisposed to becoming the physician's guardian angel.
I think so. I think so. I believe this is my philosophy. I believe we choose our parents before we're born. And if I was meant to help wounded healers, of course, I'd have 2 wounded healers as parents that I could work on from day one. And if I failed, my childhood survival would be at risk. You know what I mean? Like, I had to master physician psychology to survive my childhood. Okay.
Yeah, you were definitely, it was cosmic.
Yeah.
To use a phrase from my very early youth, very cosmic.
And then it's so funny, because some psychiatrists, there's a subset of doctors who are like, haters of me, right? I mean, very interesting group, and they're mostly female psychiatrists, and they'll be saying things like, well, what gives you the right to do a psychological autopsy on a suicide victim? And it's like, I didn't really have a good answer at the time, because I think I'm naturally, you know how some people just have innate skills, like it's like going up to Tiger Woods and say, what gives you the right to play golf? I don't know, I can just hit it in the hole, you know what I mean? Like, you know, so now they're like, well, what gives you the right to do? You don't have a degree in this. It's like, well, I don't know. My dad's a pathologist. My mom's a psychiatrist. So I think like I was born to do psychological autopsies. You know what I mean? Like that's the only thing I could come up with at the time, which I think pissed them off more. So,
but you're also in primary care, and primary care is no stranger to
yeah.
dealing with mental health.
Yeah. For 30 years, I've been helping people with mental health issues.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Pamela Wible on the show today, and there's something I wanted to mention, and that's parents of med school students and residents sometimes are the last to know. And that much is clear from your book.
I mean, they'll get a call from the police and then they know, and that's a terrible way to find out, is it not?
Yeah. And so what did they ever, when you talked to these, I know you talked to the parents too, did they ever say what they would have done differently had they known more about what was going on?
They would have tried to, first of all, some parents push their children into this career for the status and seemingly protection, you know, so I think there would be less cultural, you know, forcing your children to go into a profession that's not right for them. If you knew that you were essentially sending them to something that's more dangerous than Afghanistan, with, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that one thing would change, but also you would be able to counsel your child about whether this is the right profession for them. You know what I mean? A lot of parents either try to dissuade, but they don't have the actual data to speak about why they're trying to dissuade their children from pursuing medicine. They just know it looks hard from the outside. They would actually have facts, you know, I think if they knew what they know now, or from reading my book, for example, they would be able to say, look, you already had trouble with drug addiction in college. You know, do you think it's a good idea for you to be an anesthesiologist? You know, like that's a conversation they could actually have, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think that this would give them, I think what my book does, and having this knowledge about what really goes on in medical training, is it gives parents the right to be helicopter parents. You know, like you actually have the right to call your children once or more a day and check on them. And you should, if they're in medical school, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not being overly protective. That's being a concerned parent with a right to be concerned.
That's lines of communication. The other thing that occurred to me is when you're in med school, you've already gone through college, now you're in med school, and you're spending a lot of money. Someone's spending a lot of money for you to go to med school. Either you're taking on a lot of debt or your parents are paying for it. And so the students there, the med school is what it is. It seems to me they might be ashamed that they might be perceived as weak or can't cut it. You know, then you've got the huge cost for school. It's very tough for a student to call home and say, you know what, I don't know if I can do this. That's a tough call to make. And they don't have a lot of incentive to do that unless they've read the book, they've read the Bible, so to speak, your book. And
Bible, they're both Bible, yes.
The Wible Bible. And and very good. I like that. I think then you're both on the same page. You're all on the same page. The lines of communication are drawn, and it's not this isn't my mom or my dad being annoying. This is just them being parents,
right?
And being caring parents, and just making sure. And I think that applies to spouses of practicing physicians. They're out of residency now. They're, well, including residency, but if you're married, and spouses need to be having this conversation as well. Dr. Pamela Wible, author of Human Rights Violations in Medicine, with us today. You're there to help docs, but I saw a couple of surprisingly cool small things that patients and people in general can do that you suggest that they can do to help this situation. The two that I have in mind are thank you notes and the love letter campaign.
Yeah, that's been very effective. I don't know if people are aware, but there are people, I believe it started in England, a teenager who had considered stepping off a bridge, who decided not to. She left little love notes on that bridge, essentially saying, like, don't do it. Your life is worth it. You're precious. Like, take a step back. People love you, whatever it is, like these little note cards that she laminated, I think, and then just like tied them to the bridge, where I guess this is a popular spot for suicide. And people found her
Wow.
because those notes saved their lives and they wanted to thank her. So this isn't just like unicorns and puppy dogs, let's all hold
Mm.
hands and sing love songs. This is actually,
Right.
it works for preventing suicide, because people are looking
Right.
for, at that last dark hour, is there anyone who really cares? Would the world really miss me? To have a stranger come up to you or see a little
Wow.
love note, you know, on the top of your hospital where all the doctors step off, like that could really change your mind, you know?
Physicians are under a lot of stress. And if I'm sitting in front of my physician, if I'm a patient, and you make the suggestion that perhaps you shouldn't be like having a direct conversation about it, you can send them a note. And there's less of a defensive mechanism that goes up, because it's a very unusual type of conversation. Where are they going with this? Do they want extra medications? How are you doing, doc? Are you feeling suicidal today? That's not something you really want to bring up. But that thank you note, I thought, was an excellent idea.
Yeah, that's pretty simple, because most patients have had some experience with sending thank you notes, even to nurses after your child's born, or dentist, or your veterinarian, I mean, we all know how to write a thank you note. But I think if in the back of your mind you understand the person that you're writing this to is potentially, at some point, thinking of suicide or depressed or stressed at their work, like that comes from a different place than just saying, gee, thank you so much for saving my life in the emergency room. Like, if you could add something in there, I want you to know how valuable you are, how much, something that's more personal, like the way you explained my diabetes to me, it really helped. Nobody else has ever taken the time to do that, and I think I can really change my lifestyle now, like those sorts of things.
There's also the love letter campaign.
Right. And the love letter campaign was sort of built off of, well, I mean, I'm probably the first one that's actually, described it as a love letter campaign. It was, modeled after these notes left on a bridge, I believe. And then some medical students got together and they called it a compassion project. And they would just leave anonymous sort of, you're doing a great job, oh, thank you so much for the dedication, sort of like heartfelt letters to
Mm-hmm.
random health professionals that they would leave, like in the hospital, at the nurse's station, or um, pass out somehow anonymously, to other students. And, it just gives you some positive affirmation that otherwise you don't generally get in medical education, which is often built on, sort of noticing all your flaws and not necessarily appreciating that you saved somebody's life, right?
Right.
So that, and then I just took it a step further and sort of called them love letters, because that's just kind of more
Spreading
how
the
I
love.
them, right?
Yeah.
And encourage people to write love letters to med students and physicians. And I did a little blog post on it. But what was really funny about this is people kept sending the love letters to me as if I'm the distribution point. And it's like, well, no, really, anyone can do this. Just go drop them off at the nurse's station, or I even had some patients wanting to do this around Christmas time. It's like, just write. They found out I was doing this. They're like, oh, I want to write love letters. Maybe we'll do that with the church. Great. We'll just drop them at the emergency department, because there's people that are working on Christmas Day there who aren't feeling the love.
Right.
They're
Oh.
seeing trauma. And if they got a package of love letters from people in town, about their wonderful commitment to helping us even on Christmas Day, that would make a huge impact on them, right? And
Yeah.
bring some of them to tears, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I think it's funny the discomfort that people have with handing out love letters, that they want me to do it for them.
Well,
That's really tough.
they'll send a soldier a letter, a card,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
why not just say, hey, it's a thank you card, that
right.
a thank you, a Hallmark card or whatever, and they go in and they see the nurse's station or whatever at the ER and say, "Can you pass these out? You know, thank you
Yeah.
for being here on a holiday." And
Right.
there's another little thing I recall from a long time ago, and I asked my late father one day. I said, "So, Dad, what are you most proud of?" And he said, "I mean, aside from my family." And I said, "Yeah, basically your professional life." And he paused for a moment and he pointed to a box on a shelf. And he said, "Tell you what, open the box and read what's in there." And inside the box were a whole bunch of letters from his students, column readers, because he was a columnist, people that he's met over the years in classes and whatnot. And they were all letters saying, "Thank you so much for whatever, you know, showing me a better way of doing things and unleashing my creativity," whatever it was. So I just called it the box. And Dad would say, you know, another letter would come in. He goes, "Oh, that's really nice. Put it in the box."
Yeah.
So he would read them every now and then.
Yeah. And doctors are like that. They are definitely they're sort of compulsive about details, saving letters, saving notes. Many docs have told me they have this box, just like your dad,
Ah,
right? They keep their thank you notes. I can read you a few quotes that I think are very relevant to this
sure.
from doctors whose lives have been saved from these suicide,
Absolutely.
from these notes, right? So this is a female physician who reports, "I keep every note from my patients. It has definitely prevented my suicide. There are days I want to give up, but I see the letters, thank you cards, even art, knitting, and jewelry from patients, and I keep going. I am reminded that my life is about more than my pain and suffering."
Mm, wow.
And she goes on, "Perhaps I have to reach out more for support and allow another to experience their relevance in this world by being my healer. As physicians, we think that asking for help is a sign of weakness. Our system judges us for it. Our colleagues do too. When I leave loving notes for others, I'm seen as soft and not taken seriously professionally. What a shameful and grave display of the ignorant system we are in. What if we saw asking for help as a sacred opportunity?"
Sure. Yeah. That's powerful stuff.
And this is a male ENT who got a text that prevented his suicide. And he wrote me, he said, "This is the text message that prevented my suicide. Hey, I'm so sorry about your patient. That sucks. I'm very thankful that we have you as an excellent otolaryngologist to learn from. You take care of so many sick patients and do a marvelous job educating us how to do it safely, skillfully, and compassionately well. Thank you for that."
Just a text message.
That text message saved an ear, nose, and throat doctor's life.
Wow. You know, there's an old saying my dad loved it. There's majesty in simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Those things. You know, on a more humorous note, I handle this kind of stuff with humor. So every now and then it comes out. And as I'm reading your book, I don't know why it popped into my head, but the movie American Pie popped into my head. One of the characters, one of the lead characters, her line, "One time at band camp." So she would always begin these stories with "one time at band camp." What popped into my head was pre-med school camp, because I know you do retreats for doctors who've had enough and they want to transition into something a little more fulfilling like you did. And I thought, wait a minute, what about pre-med school camp or retreat to familiarize these kids? I can call them kids, I'm 60. To familiarize them with what can and does happen, using the book as a teaching tool, and then train them in better ways of handling situations up to and including basic self-defense, which ought to be a clue to anyone listening. There's a lot more going on in med school and residency than you might be aware of. And there's an added benefit here of going to med school with sort of a built-in support network, kind of a band of brothers. You've been through a pre-med school boot camp. And instead of figuring out who's in their corner or if there's anyone in their corner, they've got people already in the same boat as them. They're a band of brothers. And I think, you know, you got a business there. Train the trainers, because you have the brand and you have a compelling story. And that popped into my head. And if I was a parent of a kid my kid going into med school, I would definitely send them to a camp so that they could learn and have tools to handle these situations. And if it never comes up, great. But they may be able to help others in social networks. And, hey, did this happen? You know what? You need boom, 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 boom. In other words, you're multiplying yourself. You're not only trainers to train the med school pre-med students, you're also training those pre-med students to be trainers as well. This is what I learned in band camp kind of thing. And I think you're probably the only person who could pull that off, because you have the brand, if you will, and you have the compelling story, and you have the book. And I wanted to mention for the listeners, they can find out more about you at PamelaWible.com. That's WIBLE.
Or idealmedicalcare.org is great too. Either. Yeah.
I love what you said about the Wible Bible. I thought that was great. And, I wish you every success and strength in your important work. And thanks for joining me, Dr. Pamela Wible.
Thank you so much for having me. And I do hope that this helps anyone out there who's struggling, or people who are on the fence, even about pursuing medicine as a profession. I'm happy to help you figure out whether this is the right career for you, and whether you're a parent or of a medical student, a wife or husband of a current physician, a physician who's struggling, please reach out. Don't isolate. There are resources, and I am happy to help in whatever way I can.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, it's a tough thing, but you're also a real shining light. To my listeners, thank you too. And that's all for now. And please join me each week as we take a deeper dive into aspects of healthcare you won't find anywhere else. And there you are. Thanks for listening to the Winning Healthcare Food Fight Show. Hit the subscribe button to hear more expert thinking on getting better care without the mess.